The winter wind cut through the Lakota camp like a blade, carrying whispers of a stranger who had appeared at dawn. She walked slowly between the lodges, her feet leaving delicate prints in the fresh snow. No one knew where she had come from or how she had survived the frozen plains alone. She wore a tattered elkskin dress that hung loose on her thin frame, and her long black hair fell forward, partially hiding her face. But it was her silence that unsettled the people most. She did not speak. She did not cry out. She simply stood at the edge of the camp, waiting. Chief Tatanka Ayatake, known among his people as a warrior of great wisdom and strength, watched her from his lodge. He was a man in his prime, respected for his courage in battle and his fair judgment in times of peace. His wife had died during childbirth 2 winters past, taking their infant son with her. Since then, he had refused all offers of marriage, choosing instead to pour his grief into leading his people. Yet something about this silent woman stirred a feeling he thought had died with his family. He approached her slowly, aware that the entire camp watched from behind lodge flaps and around fire pits. The woman did not move as he drew near. When he stood before her, she finally lifted her eyes to meet his. They were dark and deep, holding secrets that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Tatanka noticed something else then, something that made his breath catch. Scars traced delicate lines across her throat, pale against her brown skin, disappearing beneath the collar of her dress. "You are safe here," he said gently, using the simple hand signs of the Plains tribes. "No one will harm you." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she touched her throat with trembling fingers and shook her head. The meaning was clear. She could not speak. Something, or someone, had stolen her voice. The camp's medicine woman, an ancient elder named Wihakaida, came forward with a buffalo robe. She wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders and guided her toward the warmth of a fire. The other women brought food, corn soup, and dried berries, but the stranger ate sparingly, as if she had forgotten how to trust kindness. Throughout the evening, Tatanka found himself unable to look away from her. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. That night, Wihakaida came to the chief's lodge. Her face was grave in the firelight. "I have examined her scars," she said quietly. "They were made by a blade, deliberately placed to sever her voice. Someone wanted to ensure she could never tell what she had witnessed." Tatanka felt anger rise in his chest like a living thing. Who would commit such an evil act? "That," Wihakaida replied, "is what we must discover. But there is more, my chief. Her body bears many scars, not all visible to the eye. She has endured suffering that would break most people. Yet she lives. She fights. There is a warrior spirit in that woman." In the days that followed, the silent woman became a presence in the camp. Children were initially frightened of her, but soon they discovered she could tell stories with her hands, weaving tales in the air that made them laugh and gasp. She helped the women with their work, proving skilled at beadwork and hide tanning. She moved through her tasks with a grace that suggested she had once lived a different life, perhaps one of some importance. Tatanka watched her always. He noticed how she flinched at sudden movements, how she positioned herself with her back to solid surfaces, how her eyes constantly scanned for danger. These were the habits of someone who had lived in fear for a long time. Yet he also saw her strength. She did not ask for pity. She did not seek special treatment. She simply existed with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Tatanka made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He approached the silent woman as she sat alone, working on a pair of moccasins by firelight. When she looked up, he knelt before her and spoke words that shocked the entire camp. "I wish to make you my wife." The camp erupted in whispered controversy. A chief marrying a nameless stranger? A woman who could not speak, could not tell them her lineage or her people. The elders gathered in urgent council, their faces stern with disapproval. But Tatanka stood firm before them, his jaw set with determination that reminded them why he led their people. "She is unmarried and alone," he stated plainly. "Our ways teach us to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Would you have me abandon her to die when the deep snows come? Is that the Lakota way?" The eldest councilman, a weathered warrior named Hoka, leaned forward. "You speak of protection, but you ask for marriage. These are not the same thing, Tatanka. A chief must marry wisely. His wife's family becomes bound to our people. But we know nothing of this woman's family. We do not even know her name." Tatanka had anticipated this argument. "Then I will give her a name. I will call her Wanagi Waste, Good Spirit, for she came to us like a ghost from the winter storm, and she has brought only goodness to our camp." The medicine woman Wihakaida rose slowly, her ancient bones creaking. I have watched this woman, she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. She bears the marks of the Crow people in her beadwork patterns. But she also knows the ways of the Arikara and the Mandan. This woman has lived among many tribes. Perhaps she was a captive, traded between peoples like a horse or a rifle. Whatever her story, it is written in pain across her body. She turned to face Tatanka directly. But I will say this, my chief. In my long life, I have seen many kinds of strength. The strength to fight is common among men. The strength to endure is rarer and more precious. This woman has endured things that would have killed most warriors. If you marry her, you marry not weakness but a different kind of power. The council debated through the night, but Tatanka would not be moved. Finally, as dawn approached, they granted their reluctant approval. The marriage would take place in 3 days, giving the woman time to prepare and the camp time to accept what many saw as their chief's strange choice. Wagi Waste, as she was now called, showed no outward emotion when Tatanka told her of the council's decision. But that night, Wihakaida found her weeping silently in her lodge, her shoulders shaking with soundless sobs. The old woman sat beside her and held her hand. You fear you are not worthy, Wihakaida said softly. You fear your past will poison his future. I can see it in your eyes, daughter. The silent woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. She touched her scarred throat, then placed her hand over her heart and made a breaking gesture. Yes, Wihakaida acknowledged. You are broken. But broken things, when mended with care, become stronger than they were before. The chief sees this. Perhaps you should learn to see it too. The wedding ceremony was simple but beautiful. Wagi Waste wore a dress of white deerskin that the women had prepared for her, decorated with elk teeth and blue beads. Someone had woven small white flowers into her hair, gifts forced to bloom early in the warmth of the lodges. Tatanka stood tall in his finest clothing, eagle feathers marking his status as chief and warrior. When the time came for the ritual exchange of vows, Tatanka spoke his promises clearly for all to hear. Then Wagi Waste stepped forward. She could not speak the words, but she had prepared. From a small pouch, she drew out a length of rawhide cord. On it, she had threaded dozens of tiny beads in patterns that told a story. She handed one end to Tatanka and kept the other, then wrapped the cord around both their joined hands. An old woman in the crowd gasped in recognition. It is the ancient way, she whispered. The binding of 2 paths into one. My grandmother spoke of this, but I have never seen it done. The beadwork spoke what Wanagi's voice could not. Red beads for blood spilled and survived. White beads for the scars that marked her journey. Blue beads for tears cried and those held back. Yellow beads for the hope of dawn after the longest night. And binding them all together, black beads representing the silence that had become her shield and her prison. As they stood together, hands bound by her story told in beads, something shifted in the camp's atmosphere. The people began to understand that this was not a chief taking pity on a broken woman. This was 2 wounded souls choosing to face the future together, each carrying scars that might help them understand the other's pain. That night, in Tatanka's lodge, the newly married couple sat across from each other beside the fire. For a long time, neither moved. Then Tatanka reached out and gently touched the scars on Wanagi's throat. She flinched but did not pull away. Someday, he said quietly, when you are ready, you will tell me. Not with words, but in whatever way you can. I will wait. Wanagi's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. For the first time since she had arrived in camp, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. She felt safe. Winter deepened its grip on the plains, and the Lakota camp settled into the quiet rhythm of survival. Inside Tatanka's lodge, a different kind of survival was taking place. Wagi Waste moved through her days with careful precision, learning the patterns of her new husband's life. She rose before dawn to tend the fire, prepared his meals with hands that had clearly done such work before, and kept the lodge immaculate. But she maintained a distance, always sleeping on the far side of the lodge, always avoiding his touch beyond what duty required. Tatanka watched and waited. He had fought many battles, tracked enemies across endless prairies, but nothing had prepared him for the complexity of living with a woman who could not speak yet communicated volumes through her silence. He began to notice small things. How she relaxed when he announced his presence before entering the lodge. How she positioned her sleeping robes where she could see both the entrance and his movements. How her hands never strayed far from the skinning knife she kept at her belt. One evening, he decided to try something different. Instead of sitting in his usual place of honor, he sat beside the fire in the position typically occupied by women doing beadwork. He picked up a piece of leather and some sinew, attempting to repair a torn moccasin. His stitches were clumsy and uneven. Wagi watched for a moment, then something remarkable happened. The corners of her mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. She moved closer, not quite beside him but near enough to reach out. She pointed at his work, then at her own hands, raising her eyebrows in question. He handed her the moccasin without hesitation. As she worked, her fingers moving with practiced skill, he began to speak. "My wife died in childbirth," he said quietly, staring into the flames. "The baby, my son, died with her. I held him once. He was perfect and tiny, and he never drew breath. I thought I would die from the weight of it. The grief was heavier than any burden I had carried in war." Wanagi's hands stilled. She looked at him with those deep, knowing eyes. "Everyone told me it was the way of things," Tatanka continued. "That I was young and would marry again, have other children. But I felt hollow. I went on raids I should not have survived, took risks that made the other warriors whisper that their chief sought death. Perhaps they were right." He paused, then turned to look at her directly. "You understand this, don't you? This feeling of being hollowed out, of continuing to breathe because stopping is not permitted, not because you want to." Slowly, Wanagi nodded. Then she did something unexpected. She set down the moccasin and reached for her beadwork pouch. From it, she drew out a small doeskin bundle. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a tiny pair of child's moccasins, exquisitely made, sized for a baby's feet. They were stained with old blood. Tatanka understood immediately. She too had lost a child. She pressed the small moccasins to her heart, and for the first time since he had known her, she made a sound. It was not speech but a low, broken keening that came from somewhere deep in her chest, a mother's grief that had been trapped inside for too long. Without thinking, Tatanka moved to her side and wrapped his arms around her. She stiffened at first, every muscle tense with old fears, but he held her gently, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. Gradually, she relaxed against him, her silent sobs shaking them both. They sat that way until the fire burned low, two broken people sharing the weight of losses too heavy to carry alone. After that night, something changed between them. Wanagi began to share her story, not with words but with pictures drawn in ash on flat stones, with beadwork patterns, with gestures and expressions that Tatanka learned to read like a language all its own. Piece by piece, her history emerged like a landscape appearing through lifting fog. She had been born Crow, daughter of a respected warrior. When she was young, her village had been raided by Arikara warriors. She drew this in ash, stick figures, some falling, one small figure being carried away. She had been perhaps 12 summers old, traded to the Arikara, then to white trappers, then to the Mandan. Each time, she had learned new languages, new ways. Each time, she had survived. The last camp, she showed him, had been different. She drew a figure larger than the others, a man with a crooked line for a mouth. Through her gestures, Tatanka understood. This man had claimed her as his wife, but he was cruel. When she had become pregnant, she had hoped the child would bring softness to him. Instead, the baby had been born dead, strangled by the cord. The man had blamed her, called her cursed. One night, drunk on whiskey, he had accused her of betraying him with another man. She had tried to defend herself, to speak the truth, but he had not listened. He had held her down while another man cut her throat, deliberately missing the major vessels that would have killed her but severing the parts that gave her voice. They had left her for dead in the snow. But she had not died. She had crawled to a river, treated her wounds with mud and spider webs as she had seen medicine women do, and survived through sheer will. She had walked for many days before finding Tatanka's camp, driven by some instinct that told her she would find safety there. As she finished her story, drawn in pictures and gesture, acted out in pantomime, Tatanka felt rage such as he had never known. But beneath the rage was something else. Awe. This woman before him had endured horrors that would have broken most warriors, yet she lived. She functioned. She found moments of peace. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," he told her, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Spring came slowly to the plains, melting the snow in reluctant patches and turning the earth to mud. The Lakota camp prepared for the buffalo hunt, the men checking their weapons and the women preparing the travois and drying racks. It should have been a time of excitement and renewal, but an uneasy tension settled over the people like a blanket. Scouts had reported strangers in the area, a mixed group of white trappers and Arikara warriors camped 3 days' ride to the east. Wanagi felt the change immediately. Her hands trembled as she worked, and she started at every sudden sound. Tatanka noticed how she had returned to old behaviors, sleeping with her knife clutched in her hand, positioning herself where she could watch the lodge entrance. One morning, he found her outside before dawn, standing rigid as a post, staring toward the east where the strangers had been spotted. He approached her carefully, as he had learned to do. "You know them," he said quietly. It was not a question. She nodded once, sharply. Then she grabbed a stick and drew rapidly in the dirt. A large man, indicated by broad shoulders. A crooked line for his mouth. The same figure from her earlier stories. Her tormentor lived, and he was close. "He will not touch you again," Tatanka promised, his hand moving to his knife. "I swear this on my life and honor." But Wagi shook her head frantically. She drew more figures, many of them, surrounding the camp. She made gestures of fighting, of death. She was trying to tell him that confrontation would mean war, would mean the deaths of people who had shown her kindness. She pointed at herself, then made a motion of walking away, leaving. "No," Tatanka said firmly. "You are Lakota now. You are my wife. We do not surrender our own to appease our enemies." He called a council immediately. The warriors gathered in the ceremonial lodge, their faces grim as Tatanka explained the situation. Some argued for immediate attack, to strike the strangers before they could threaten the camp. Others counseled caution, suggesting they move the entire camp to summer hunting grounds early, avoiding conflict altogether. Old Hoka, who had initially opposed the marriage, spoke with surprising heat. "This woman is one of us now. If these men come seeking her, they insult not just our chief but all our people. The Lakota do not cower from threats." But the peace chiefs argued against rash action. "We do not know their intentions," one said. "Perhaps they are simply passing through. To attack without provocation would make us no better than raiders." The debate raged for hours until a young scout burst into the lodge, breathless. "They come." The strangers approach under a white flag, requesting counsel with our chief. Tatanka's eyes met Wihakaida's across the lodge. The old medicine woman nodded slightly. This was the moment they had both known would come. He turned to his warriors. "Prepare for treachery, but receive them with honor. We will hear what they have to say." The strangers entered the camp at midday, a group of 5 trappers and 3 Arikara warriors. They were led by a massive man with a scarred face and a mouth that twisted downward at one corner, exactly as Wagi had drawn. His eyes swept the camp with casual arrogance until they landed on Wagi, who stood behind Tatanka. Recognition flared in his expression, followed by something darker. Possession. "Chief," the man said in broken Lakota, his accent marking him as French. "I am called Beecham. I come seeking what is mine. That woman there, she is my wife. She ran from me during the winter. I have come to take her back." A collective intake of breath rippled through the gathered Lakota. Tatanka remained perfectly still, his face impassive. "The woman you speak of is my wife now. She came to us alone and seeking protection. I have given it." Beecham's face darkened. "You married another man's wife? This is theft. Among my people, this is a crime worthy of death." "Among my people," Tatanka replied evenly, "a man who cuts a woman's throat and leaves her to die has forfeited all claims to her. Show us your proof of marriage. Where is her family who agreed to this union? Where are the gifts you gave for her hand? You have nothing but your word, and your word is worthless." The French trapper's hand moved toward his rifle, but the Lakota warriors surrounding the council area shifted subtly, their own weapons ready. Beecham noticed and forced a smile that looked more like a snarl. "Perhaps we can negotiate. I am a reasonable man. I will take payment for her instead. 10 rifles, 20 blankets, and a horse." "She is not for sale," Tatanka stated flatly. "Everything is for sale, Chief. Including the lives of your people if you refuse me." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Before Tatanka could respond, Wagi stepped forward. Every eye turned to her as she walked slowly toward Beecham, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she stood before him, she reached up and deliberately, defiantly, unwrapped the scarf covering her throat. The scars he had given her stood out pale and terrible against her skin. Then she did something extraordinary. She opened her mouth and, with tremendous effort, forced out a sound. It was not speech, not quite, but a rasping, harsh noise that might have been a single word. No. It was the first sound anyone in the Lakota camp had heard her make beyond that night of weeping. The effect was electric. Beecham actually took a step back, something like fear flickering across his face. Wagi continued her silent testimony. She pulled up her sleeves, showing the scars of old burns and cuts. She turned, showing her back, where the marks of a whip were barely visible through her dress. She faced the gathered people, both Lakota and strangers, and let them see what had been done to her. Then she walked back to stand beside Tatanka, her head held high. The message was clear to everyone watching. This was not a runaway wife. This was a survivor of torture. "Leave our lands," Tatanka commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "If you are seen near our camp again, we will consider it an act of war." Beecham and his men left the Lakota camp, but their departure brought no relief. Tatanka doubled the guards and kept scouts ranging far beyond their usual territory. He knew men like the French trapper. They did not accept defeat easily, and they rarely traveled without plans for revenge. The camp prepared for war, the warriors checking their weapons daily, the women and children ready to flee at a moment's notice. Wagi moved through these preparations with a strange calmness. She had faced her demon and survived again. But Tatanka noticed something new in her eyes, a determination that had not been there before. She began spending long hours with Wihakaida, the old medicine woman, teaching her the healing herbs and sacred songs. Though Wagi could not sing the words, she learned the rhythms, humming them in her broken voice. One evening, as Tatanka cleaned his rifle, Wagi approached him with her beadwork pouch. She had been working on something in secret for weeks. Now she revealed it, a war shirt, magnificently decorated with quillwork and beads in patterns that told their shared story. Red for blood and sacrifice, white for scars and survival, blue for tears and healing, yellow for hope and new beginnings. Across the chest, she had worked a symbol that made his breath catch. Two figures, standing together, a cord binding their hands. Their story, woven into protection. "It is beautiful," he said softly. "But I hope I will not need to wear it in battle." She touched his face gently, then pointed to her own chest, over her heart. She made the sign for strong, and then pointed at him. The meaning was clear. The shirt was not just for physical protection but to remind him that love itself was armor. 3 days later, the attack came. But it did not come in the way anyone expected. Beecham had hired more men, trappers, and renegades who cared nothing for tribal politics. They came at dawn, not to raid the camp but to kidnap Wagi specifically. They had watched and waited, learning her routines, and they struck when she went to fetch water from the stream. She fought like a wildcat, her knife flashing in the early light, but there were too many. They bound her and threw her across a horse, galloping away before the alarm could properly be raised. By the time Tatanka and his warriors mounted pursuit, the raiders had a significant lead. But Wagi was not the helpless victim they assumed. As they rode, she worked at her bonds with a patience born of long suffering. The men had tied her wrists in front rather than behind, a critical mistake. She had secreted a small blade in her hair, a trick Wihakaida had taught her. Slowly, carefully, she sawed at the rawhide, waiting for her moment. It came when they stopped to rest the horses. Beecham approached her, his face twisted in triumph. "You thought you could escape me? Thought some savage chief could protect you? I told you, woman. You are mine until I say otherwise." Wagi looked up at him, and he must have seen something in her eyes because he hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, she struck. Her bonds fell away, and her hidden blade flashed up and across, cutting deep into his gun hand. He screamed and staggered back as she rolled away, coming to her feet like a warrior. She did not run. Instead, she faced them all, a small woman alone against 6 armed men, her knife held steady, her stance that of a fighter. "Come," she rasped in her broken voice. "I die standing." But she did not die. The thunder of hooves announced Tatanka and his warriors cresting the hill, war cries splitting the morning air. The raiders broke and ran, dragging the wounded Beecham with them. Tatanka leaped from his horse before it fully stopped, reaching Wagi in 3 long strides. "You are hurt," he said, seeing blood on her arms and face. She shook her head, pointing after the fleeing raiders. "Not her blood. Theirs." On the ride back to camp, Tatanka rode with Wagi in front of him on his horse, his arms around her. She leaned back against his chest, trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of battle. "You fought well," he told her. "Like the warrior I always knew you were." That night, the camp celebrated their chief's wife, the silent woman who had proven stronger than anyone imagined. They honored her with songs and stories, and for the first time, Wagi joined in their joy without holding back. She could not speak their words, but she danced their dances, laughed in her voiceless way, and allowed herself to be fully present in the moment. In the quiet hours before dawn, alone in their lodge, Tatanka held his wife close. "You could have run," he said. "When they took you, you could have let them carry you away, saved us from the risk of fighting." Wanagi pulled back to look at him. She touched her scarred throat, then placed her hand over his heart. She made the sign for home, and then the sign for fight. The meaning resonated between them. This was her home now, these were her people, and some things were worth fighting for. She took his hand and placed it over her own heart so he could feel it beating strong and steady. Then she did something she had never done before. She kissed him, not with the duty of a wife but with the passion of a woman who had chosen her path and would walk it without fear. Months later, Wihakaida would teach Wanagi a final lesson. Your voice was taken, the old woman said, but it was never truly lost. You speak in the language of survival, of courage, of love that persists beyond all reason. These words are more powerful than any that could come from your throat. And it was true. Though Wanagi Waste never spoke again in the way she once had, her story echoed through the generations. She became a symbol of endurance, a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that refuses to be silenced, no matter what cruelty tries to steal it away. In time, she bore Tatanka 3 children, and she taught them all the same lesson she had learned through blood and suffering and ultimate triumph. That scars are not marks of weakness but evidence of survival, and that love, real love, is not about healing all wounds but about choosing to stand together despite them.